If the explanation by NIST on what caused the initial collapse seems seriously flawed, their explanation on what caused the complete destruction of the towers does not exist. Within more than 10,000 pages filled with technical data of relative importance, in a footnote on page 82 of the NIST report we read, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity of this report, the sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. With the simple word inevitable, NIST purports to have explained the total destruction of 80,000 tons of a perfectly healthy steel structure upon itself.
The area below the damage zone where the planes flew in and where the fire was, that area below that, those 80 or 90 stories, 80,000 tons of structural steel was not damaged in any way. Yet you stood there and watched it destroy itself floor by floor, all 287 structural columns, as if they didn't exist underneath the damage zone.
When a well-known debunking website wrote to NIST asking for a clarification on the sequence of the collapses, it received a similar answer. NIST did not describe the specific sequence of events after global collapse initiated.
NIST acknowledges in their response to a request for correction that they are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Yet they refuse to consider the possibility that explosives or some other form of demolition device could have been used to cause the collapses of the towers, and the fact that controlled demolition is consistent with all the available technical evidence. The request for correction was filed by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and many others who simply don't believe that the collapse has been explained properly. And the response to that request for correction is NIST simply saying they're unable to provide a full explanation for the total collapse, even though that was their task given to them by Congress.
This astonishing statement has been repeated by NIST over and over again under the most surprising of justifications.
Once the collapse initiated, the video evidence is rather clear. It was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate that, what is clear from the good videos.
This is tantamount to saying, once the Pearl Harbor attack initiated, the video evidence shows that the U.S. fleet was quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese, so we didn't feel the need to find out why it happened.
And then we're left with this phrase, global collapse ensued, with, it looks like, no further questions asked.
Yeah, and so that again gets to the fact that many of the questions are left unanswered. You know, the fall time itself of the buildings of approximately 10 to 12 seconds, according to NIST, seems to defy the idea of the resistance that would have been from the floors below. You know, if each of the floors had caused just a hesitation just for half a second, we would need another 40 seconds for the buildings to have collapsed. There should have been some sort of a deceleration given the massive structure below, but we didn't see that. And there was no mention of the things people called squibs, these cannon-like bursts of material that appear to be explosive effects that were occurring 10 to 30 floors below the collapse front.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure.
And naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. And I estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
So something's happening to throw these things horizontally at those kinds of speeds.
There's no mention of the molten metal that was existing, pouring from the building and then rubble piles.
Get down below and you'd see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was
like
lava from a volcano.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
The fires got very intense down there and actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
And they pulled out the big block of concrete and
there was like a little river of steel flowing.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And almost like a chunk of lava from Kilauea or Iceland, where they're very sharp but breakable shards on the end here.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
And a lot of other evidence was just ignored by NIST simply not addressing the collapse dynamics.
Do you feel that they only went so far because they actually realized that there were so many problems that they'd have to deal with at that point that they think, well, let's just take our investigation so far and just stop there because of all these problems?
Yeah, I think that's what happened. That's my guess.
To make up for this embarrassing void, the debunkers often point at some independent studies which purport to explain the collapses by gravity alone.
Ci sono opere tecniche come quelle che vedete citate qui che analizzano in estremo dettaglio la dinamica del crollo delle torri gemelle e non trovano niente di strano.
The study most quoted by debunkers is called What Did and Did Not Cause the Collapse of the WTC Twin Towers in New York by Czech engineer Zdeněk Bazant. But in his own study, Mr. Bazant admits to have worked on a one-dimensional model, while he states, the high tilt seen on the South Tower top would call for a three-dimensional model of progressive collapse.
And this report does not provide a technical analysis of the structural behavior of the building during the collapse itself. They stop their analysis where they say the south wall buckled. And then they depend on a professor, a civil engineering professor from Northwestern University, Dr. Zdeněk Bazant, who did an analysis where he claims a progressive collapse could collapse the building. But he starts his analysis after a one-story fall. So here we have a gap between this alleged south wall buckling. What isn't explained is the propagation across the rest of the building before it falls one story. Nobody explains that. That's completely left open in the NIST report. They have not explained it.
In any case, it is not up to private studies to explain the collapse of the Twin Towers. NIST received $20 million of taxpayers' money to determine why and how World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2 collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft, and to this day, they have not done so.
Oh my God!
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions. Boom, 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 boom. The whole building just went, and as the bombs were going, people just started running, and I sat there and watched a few of them explode.
The idea that these buildings came down because of explosions, and even, more specifically, because of explosives planted in the building, was an idea found all over the place on 9/11, on the scene.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
It didn't fall over. It looked as if somebody put TNT all throughout that building. Tower number one, the second tower collapsed. It was the exact same series of detonation.
1013-02 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
There's so many videos of witnesses from that day that report explosions. There's radio transmissions from the FDNY. We have the transcripts that were recorded, back in 2001 of all these firefighters and first responders reporting explosions.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
This testimony should have caused the presumption that there was a good chance explosive residue would be found and justified testing for it, rather than the opposite.
It appears that an aircraft of some sort did hit the side of the Pentagon. The left front, which faces sort of toward the cemetery.
The way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
According to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
If we ask about the National Institute of Standards and Technology now, which was given the specific job of figuring out why these buildings collapsed, how many references are there to eyewitnesses to explosions in the towers in the 295 pages of the final report? 0. Not one. Now, some people think, oh, well, but that's natural because NIST only deals with hard stuff, you know, like column size and whatnot. They're not concerned with soft stuff like eyewitness evidence. False. NIST was proud of the interviews it conducted. It had a sophisticated methodology. It planned it from early on, and you can find it described in Chapter 7. Phone interviews, one-on-one interviews, face-to-face, focus groups. But they appear not to have directed them to this question, so that they give detailed information about what was happening at various times in the building, but we hear nothing about this. Now, you need to know that the 9/11 Commission and NIST had access to the same material that I have access to. It's not as if I have some mysterious sources here. And yet they both miss my 156 eyewitnesses to explosions, not to mention many other eyewitnesses that are not in my list. Whether that's deliberate suppression of evidence, which would be a crime, or whether it's simply massive incompetence, does not concern me today, because either way, we have an investigation that is thoroughly inadequate, and that's why we need a new one. And I want to end with one last guy, Gary Gates. I looked up and the building exploded. The whole top came off like a volcano. And, you know, Gary Gates could, of course, be wrong, but if you ask me if 156 are wrong, I'm going to say no, I don't think so. Thank you.